Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning to those watching from the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Lauren Speranza, Director for Transatlantic Defense and Security at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA for short, and I'm coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to help kick off today's event on NATO's response to the coronavirus pandemic, which is the latest in our Common Crisis series of events and analysis exploring the implications of the pandemic for the transatlantic community. And as an alliance most often focused on conventional defense and deterrence, NATO's role in crisis management, such as the outbreak of COVID-19, is often overlooked. But NATO has played an important role in helping allies cope with the coronavirus. And while it may not have received the most attention, NATO has shown its ability to adapt and address a wide range of challenges, while making sure that a health crisis did not become a security crisis. We believe there are some important lessons to learn from NATO's response, lessons that will help us shape how we think about NATO's future. As our security environment becomes increasingly diverse, how will NATO's role continue to evolve? How can the alliance prepare to take on new kinds of threats while balancing traditional defense responsibilities? Well, here to help us unpack some of those questions today are two distinguished NATO officials essential to the alliance's crisis response. First, we have NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Executive Management, Giedrimas Jeglinskas. In his current capacity, Mr. Jeglinskas has responsibility for management of the NATO headquarters, and he advises the Secretary General closely on these issues. Before assuming his current post, Mr. Jeglinskas served as the Vice Minister of Defense of Lithuania, and prior to that, he worked in corporate banking at Citigroup, serving in various posts around the world. He's a former Lithuanian Army officer with experience as a platoon commander and an intelligence analyst in the Ministry of Defense. He also graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and spent several years living in the United States. I'm also pleased to welcome the Director General of NATO's International Military Staff, Lieutenant General Hans-Werner Veerman. He's responsible for the coordination between the decision-making bodies of the alliance, the two strategic commanders, national military staff working in Brussels, and the civilian international staff to help advise NATO's military committee. He's led a formidable career in both military policy and operational roles. Most recently, he was Germany's military representative to NATO. He was also the Bundeswehr's commander for territorial missions, where he worked on adaptation challenges for both NATO and the European Union, such as civil military cooperation and civil preparedness, which are certainly priorities these days. In addition to serving in the field, he's also worked on political military issues, arms control, and security policy in a variety of positions across the German Joint Staff, the Federal Foreign Office, and the German Ministry of Defense. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us. I'd like to come to each of you with a few opening questions just to kick off our conversation, and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers from our audience. So speakers, I'll ask you just to limit your initial responses to my questions to 2 minutes each. And we really do want this to be an interactive session, so I encourage all of you watching to join it. For those of you participating via Zoom, if you'd like to pose a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your window. Click on this and it will allow you to type in your question and I will pose them to the speakers. And if you're tuning into our webcast on Twitter, please submit your questions at CEPA under the live stream tweet using the hashtag Common Crisis or NATO 2030, and they'll be sent to us here. So I'll open it up to all of you at about the halfway point, but please feel free to start submitting your questions now so we can collect as many as possible. And as a reminder, today's discussion is, of course, on the record. And with that, let's dive in. So first, to ASG Jeglinskas, to start us off, could you help us paint the picture of what it's been like at NATO HQ since the outbreak of COVID-19? I mean, in your role, you're responsible for so many of the practical elements in Brussels, from the employees to the facilities to the technology needs. So what were some of your first priorities to make sure that NATO could still do its job despite the constraints of the pandemic? And what were some of your biggest lessons learned from this process?
Congratulations to you on your personal achievement of joining CEPA. A great institution, a great partner for NATO, a great partner for a lot of NATO nations. So we hope to do a lot of work with you personally and with the CEPA in the future. Now, going to the COVID-19 situation, I think it would be an understatement to say that this is an unprecedented, historically unseen event, unpredictable and volatile, etc. I think this is we are where we are now. From NATO's perspective, one important thing is that change and adaptation and crisis management is embedded into NATO's DNA structure. Essentially, for the past 70 years, the whole NATO's throughout NATO's existence, NATO has dealt with crises. So it was not the first; it will not be the last one. Now, I think what's important to note is that our mission is very clear: is to defend freedom. This mission is being accomplished through three main pillars. That's collective security, cooperative security, collective defense, and crisis management. And crisis management is really essential part of what we do. Now, the way it started with the COVID-19, we really focused on two main objectives, and that's what what I've been taught in the Army. This is what I've been taught in the both in the U.S. Military Academy, and we see that in many other settings. Is basically taking care of people and accomplishing our mission. So, really, just to quickly go through these two elements. So, first of all, it's important to take care of our people, ensure that they are safe, that they're able to work in a secure, healthy environment. And for that, we had to implement a lot of practical measures, such as temperature checks. We minimized the number of people, coming into office to sort of bare minimum. I wouldn't say it's as low as many other typical civilian institutions, but we're still minimizing the number of people quite substantially. And another important element is really communicating it to all of staff, all close to 5,000 people who come or who stay at home during the teleworking session, that what's happening at the headquarters, what's happening in Belgium, what's happening in Brussels, what's happening in the world. The second element is really continuing to achieve our mission, to go for our mission of decision making. Here we have to protect our ability to preserve decision making ability. Now, what that means is that we need to ensure that nations, that the NAC, North Atlantic Council, is able to meet, able to make decisions, and we remain relevant. So I think with that, we kind of establish the basis of kind of crisis management exercise. But as the people are safe, we take care of our people, we ensure that we're able to accomplish our mission, but because NAC can make these decisions. This is the path to a resilient organization. Again, something we strive as an organization, and we're well on the way to that.
Thanks so much for helping to lay that out. I think one of the most important ways that NATO has adapted has been its ability to do a secure virtual ministerial meeting. And not just because of the social distancing aspect, but because it assembles allied leaders quickly from wherever they are to support rapid decision making. Do you think this is the way of the future, or are there constraints in doing this in the long term?
I think, it's a great way when a minister calls another minister on the phone. It's even better when they have a video teleconference where they see each other, through a TV or some other technology. But there's no better way to meet, to forge relationships, to build those relationships to the level that we need. I think, especially when we talk about security, about kind of national responsibilities, about what NATO is all about. I think live meetings are essential. Now, having said that, technology now allows us to conduct these video teleconference defense ministerials and foreign ministerials online, and that's absolutely a necessity in this day of age. We don't know what sort of crisis can hit. It's part of a right business continuity planning. It's part of our resilience strategy. We need to be able to have these meetings conducted through VTC. Is that a preferred method? I think no minister will tell you that this is, this has been ideal. But to be honest, we were able to get those meetings done. Decisions have been made. I think we're moving forward with this as before. But again, of course, the preferred method is always a live meeting, because that's where the relationships are being made.
Thank you. General Veerman, I'd like to come to you now. Military mobility has been an increasing priority in Europe, and I know that's something that you've worked on directly in the past. Can you talk to us a little bit about how military mobility, meaning moving equipment and forces across Europe also translates to crisis mobility? And how does that enable NATO to support civil crises like the coronavirus?
Lauren, first of all, thank you much for your kind words of introduction, and thank you much for having the opportunity to be on this forum. Let me start with a very basic military observation. In military planning, three factors are key. One is forces, of course, it's space and time. And if you want to combine the three key elements, you end very quickly up with mobility. So mobility connects the dots. Mobility connects time, space, and forces. So, and this is true for military operation. This is true for crisis management. And this certainly is true when we want to help civilians in need. As you have alluded to, we have done some extensive work to improve mobility through Europe. And let me just mention one example, that's the Rapid Air Movement Initiative, where NATO, in very close partnership with Eurocontrol, which is physically very close by, made an arrangement where we are allowed to use a NATO call sign. And the NATO call sign gives us priority in European airspace. And the 10th of July, on the 10th of April, we made the first use of this Rapid Air Mobility Initiative. And the Turkish flight brought personal protective equipment from Turkey to the United Kingdom. So you see that our preparation for military movement are quite helpful when we have to move sources and resources that are at the essence to deal with this pandemic crisis.
Certainly. And beyond that, also a great example of allied solidarity as well. ASG Jeglinskas, I think it's important to highlight as part of this conversation that NATO, through its nations, has more than just hard military capabilities. And in fact, crisis management, as you mentioned, one of NATO's core tasks involves using civil tools. And one of the most prominent that we've heard about is the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center, the EADRCC. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the EADRCC does and how it's been helping respond to the pandemic?
Well, Lauren, I think, Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordinating Center, that's quite a mouthful of an acronym, but it does serve as a symbol of our unified effort. First of all, it's a coordinating entity, able to coordinating different actors from different nations to ensure that we're able to provide a certain, assets, hard assets, logistical assets to support our partners, our allies in times of crisis. So with the EADRCC, I think we have quite a few good successes. The most recent one was just several days ago when EADRCC coordinated essentially transaction enabled the British Air Force to transport medical supplies to Ghana. I think this shows success. It shows also basically that it's a symbol, I think, of NATO's growing role as a global actor, something actually that Secretary General has talked about in the past as well. So I think if we go with this with EADRCC program and we look at it, basically it serves as an example to how cooperation can be done in times of crisis. And I think we show unity, we show broad effort, we show impact by delivering goods to people and to countries affected most by the crisis. And we do that not just for our allies, for our allies in the alliance, but also for partners around the world. So it's it's been quite a successful, well publicized, but also well impacted exercise for the alliance.
Indeed. Well, in addition to the health implications of the pandemic, there are also broader political dynamics here at play. And we've seen both state actors and non-state actors trying to use the crisis to undermine some of that solidarity and unity that you're talking about, to try and undermine trust in our democratic institutions like NATO. And just as a couple of examples, I mean, both Russia and China have used social media to promulgate conspiracy theories about the West's response and to promote their own authoritarian regimes. So what is NATO doing to help address this kind of propaganda and disinformation?
Lauren, this is a huge topic at NATO. It's a huge topic at the nation states. within the members of the alliance. What we have witnessed in the COVID war, in the COVID kind of past 3-4 months, is a well-coordinated, well-planned, meticulously executed disinformation campaigns by, as you mentioned, Russia, China, but also some non-state actors. Now, if we try to digest that, you would see that this is nothing too new in terms of the approach. I think I come from Lithuania. We've been under these sort of disinformation attacks for years. Now we have a German-led EFP battalion on our soil. They have been affected by this disinformation campaigns from the Russian side. So we have been dealing with that, on a national level, but also on the international, on the NATO level. And what this, COVID crisis has exposed is really, it's amplified the disinformation narratives by adding this sort of COVID umbrella on top of that, and essentially expanding the list, the spectrum of the topics that an entity, Russia, China, or a non-state entity can attack. So we've seen that. Another important, I think, element is this has been reflected also in the report recently published by the Secretary General on the disinformation in the COVID-19 world, is the unprecedented level of sort of a correlating messages that come from Russia and China. If you were to look at the call it Venn diagrams of the different narratives that Russia and China are trying to portray, they intersect quite a bit nowadays. And this really shows that the COVID has allowed both of these countries to strengthen their efforts and to widen the scope of the messaging. Now, what can we do? I think that the key here is staying united. The way, unwavering unity in terms of dealing with this information is absolutely essential. Another element is, of course, monitoring. We need to continuously actively monitor the situations, the media, the various mediums. I mean, the social media in and of itself is changing as we speak. There are different mediums appearing, and some are becoming less popular, others are becoming more popular. So it's important to have that really wide approach to different media outlets. Identifying bad behavior, identifying the fake news, absolutely critical. This is we stand on the side of right information, of what's correct, what's precise, what's factual, and of course working with partners. I think one of the key areas where we work well with the European Union in sort of the broad defense and security area is really disinformation and kind of hybrid dealing with hybrid threats and warfare. So disinformation is really critical part of that. We need to continue to do that, both with the EU, but also other partners. We have partners in Asia that are, longstanding NATO's partners of values, I would say that. And of course, we counter that with facts. Now, this is very interesting, and it's an extremely challenging, problem to deal with. I think over 50 years ago, a Canadian philosopher, Marshall McLuhan, he said, he wrote along the lines, and I'm loosely paraphrasing, is that a medium's content is actually going to be less effective than medium itself in influencing how we think and how we act. So content, providing the right content is essential, but also we have to monitor and understand how the mediums themselves are changing. So it's an evolving, fascinating problem to deal with, but we have the right people on top of that. So I'm pretty optimistic.
That's great to hear. It's been interesting to watch how NATO has evolved to add new positions and new initiatives focused on that kind of work. And I like your point about partners of values, and perhaps we might start to see increased outreach to some of those democratic partners that you mentioned, even in Asia. General Veerman, I'd love to come back to you. On June 17th and 18th, Allied defense ministers had their latest virtual meeting, and part of that was focused on preparing for a possible second wave of the coronavirus. And the Secretary General announced a few key decisions as part of this. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that new response plan involves?
Well, first of all, I think we were quite well prepared for the crisis, despite the fact that everybody would agree that you can qualify it as a black swan, a century pandemic, a strategic shock, whatever you will use, you will probably get it right using these category of words. So to say we are prepared is a bit daring, but I have to say that we had some very useful mechanisms in place, and you have just discussed the EADRCC, and I would add the NATO procurement agency, NSPA, Supply and Procurement Agency. So we had some very useful institutions, and the key was in the first reaction to make them usable for the needs of our allies and our partners, and I think this worked quite well. On top of that, we had, of course, lessons learned. And just to share one lesson with you, to be successful in a competitive supply chain, you have to have money on hand in order to be a successful bidder on the market. If you don't have this money on hand, you won't get the scarce resources you dearly need. So therefore, that was one lesson learned. Another lesson clearly is that first and foremost, nations adhere to Article 3. They take care of themselves. They use their military means, and I think they have extensively used their military capacities in many, many countries. And of course, they are reluctant at the beginning to provide resources to others because it was a strategic shock and nobody really had a good understanding of what the scale would be at the end of the crisis, or now we call it the end maybe of the first wave. So there was a reluctance. But now coming to your question on the COVID response plan preparation for the second wave. So we try to utilize the lessons we have identified and hopefully learned to prepare better for the second wave. This includes, for example, that we identify special military capabilities, medical capabilities, transport capabilities, CBRN capabilities, which might be useful. Having said that, it would be too early to identify specific units because we want to remain flexible and we have to find out who is in demand and who at that moment in time, as this is a very dynamic pandemic, is in a position to provide capabilities. So we have to remain flexible, but that's built in this COVID response plan. The second thing is we are setting up kind of stockpile where nations can already now, and some have already contributed scarce resources made available to NATO in case of need somewhere else. We'll look at a trust fund that will allow us to buy something on the market, either to stock it already now, but this needs to be very carefully balanced because we may not know what is in high demand at the moment of need. So maybe we'll have to introduce some element of flexibility here as well. So we will have the money, we'll have a good overview over our capabilities, and that is prepared. So we should be even better in our reaction to the second wave than we were in reaction to this black swan in the first wave.
Thank you for outlining that. Very helpful to hear those concrete plans and that NATO is doing what it does best and learning lessons from prior experiences. I want to start to think about what this means for NATO's future. And at the ministerial meeting, Allied leaders also talked about improving national resilience to prepare for other types of emerging crises or hybrid threats. And this includes things like protecting critical infrastructure, like transportation routes, energy, communications networks. But those are often operated by civilians or companies within nations. So I'd be curious to hear from you on what is NATO's role in protecting these things, and to go back to ASGA Glinska's point earlier about cooperating with partners, should NATO be doing more to coordinate with the private sector and the European Union here?
Well, first of all, I think it's worthwhile to consider that NATO consists of two separate elements. One is the nation or the nations, the allies, who have certain responsibilities, and you can look in the Washington Treaty where they outlined, and Article 3 particularly refers to the nation responsibilities and capabilities. And the second element clearly is NATO as an institution, as an organization you are talking to today, and we both are representing this organization. And a particular strength in this organization is that we have a unique military command structure, which is in a position to organize large-scale activities. So that is something that is existing, that is unique, which we can benefit from. When you ask about resilience, I mean, the pandemic has shown that we have critical infrastructure in areas where we not have waited for it and looked at it. For example, supply chains. I mean, supply chains are now under discussion. Obviously, this is an element of critical infrastructure. And just to share one observation with you, resilience is expensive. And if you leave resilience to actors that are only looking for making money, then you will probably not end up with a lot of resilience because they wait for somebody else to provide resilience so that they can continue with their business. So therefore, I think we have lessons to learn and to rebalance what is the responsibility of an institution like NATO and what's the responsibility of the private sector. I think this is a very valuable lessons learned process we are in. And we are not looking with that, I think, to the second wave we have discussed of the pandemic. We are looking at the next pandemic, which will hopefully hit us only in 100 years, some say in 30 years, but we should be better prepared. And of course, you ask about cooperation. 22 nations are members of the European Union and also members of NATO. The sentence of we have a single set of forces is very well known, but we also have amongst these 22 member states also a single set of resources. So ideally, we should complement our activities, use our unique strength of organizing large-scale activities, logistical activities, or military operations, and the strong civilian toolbox of the European Union to the benefit of all of us. That would be the ideal vision and the ideal world. Of course, we have to keep in mind that many members of NATO in Europe are not part of the European Union, and they have to be looked after, particularly from NATO, that's for sure. But ideally, we should complement each other.
Absolutely. And even while the EU has the ability to legislate and to help implement some of those guidelines for national resilience, certainly NATO has a role to play in informing those guidelines too. ASG Jeglinskas, I know in your capacity as Vice Minister of Defense for Lithuania, you spent time working on these issues too, especially the cyber piece. From your perspective, how is NATO doing on cybersecurity? As we think about NATO's future environment, certainly there will be increasing cyber elements and cyber threats. So what more should allies be doing on that front?
Again, another extremely relevant topic and question. As we all know, cyber is now part of military is a military domain. So military is taking a serious note of what cyber is, what it means for the military operations. NATO as well. It shows that NATO is very much on top of those things as well in terms of cyber defense and understanding the cyber elements and what cyber means in terms of the deterrence and defense. Cyber pledge is only one element, I think, of what we do. Now, another thing to consider about cyber is that actually it is a generic technology. It's a general technology, just like artificial intelligence, just like electricity or anything else that powers everything. And that affects really everything that we touch. I think as 5G comes into play in the next year or a couple of years, I think we'll have a lot more things, Internet of Things to connect. At the same time, we become more vulnerable to various attacks and recriminations by sort of rogue elements. So cyber is absolutely essential element that we need to look at it either through civilian or military or really both domains. Now, yes, in Lithuania, we're a small country. I think the true benefits of that is that we're able to gather the right people and set the priorities right fairly quicker because we have fewer people, and I think it's we've been also exposed to various cyber attacks by certain actors in the East. Quite frequently. But I think one conceptual approach, and I think that works both, at public institutions, it works in private institutions, it works in national governments, local governments, is really a very structured approach to cyber defense. And first of all, it's prioritization. As elevating the cyber elements, the technological cyber, as well as policy elements, what relates to cyber defense into the highest elements of decision making. That's what it means by priority. Now, second thing is investing. Now, if you say you prioritize it, but you're not putting your money where your mouth is, it's not really prioritization. So that prioritization needs to follow with the right investments, with sizable investments. It's there's no free lunch, and as technologies, they grow exponentially, they progress. We need to constantly not just invest in technology, but also invest in upgrades of technologies. This is absolutely essential. And the third element, I think that's we've proven quite well in Lithuania, I think in many other countries in a similar way, is having really clear chain of command, responsibility. Who owns it? Who's the sole owner of that file, either nationally, if you're talking about the national government, or an international organization like NATO or many others, or private corporation. We need to have very clear ownership. Only with that ownership can you really ensure that the cyber file is being taken care of properly. And I think fragmentation in responsibility really causes a lot of dangers in going down the road. So I think NATO with all is applying exactly that approach. We are prioritizing this as a critical element of a deterrence and defense posture. We're investing money, and we're doing certain internal changes and progression really in terms of identifying clear actors and responsibilities in terms of who's managing the cyber file.
That's really important. And speaking of cyberspace, one of the alliance's biggest competitors now in cyberspace is of course China. And outlining his vision for NATO 2030, Secretary General Stoltenberg called on the alliance to stand up to China. And although China is not primarily a military threat to NATO right now, it poses many security-related risks for allies, whether that's disinformation around the coronavirus or possible manipulation of 5G infrastructure for espionage or other purposes. So obviously NATO is not the total answer here, but what should NATO's role be in a broader transatlantic approach to China?
Well, I think we have to go back also to the conceptual / historical approach. I think what we're seeing now is magnitude of a rise of a country of that scale that has been, we haven't seen in centuries. You can go back to the historical analysis where a lot of us here, a lot of probably your listeners here in this show have, political science students who've studied, Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars, and Graham Allison talking about, the Thucydides trap, that the rising power can create, conflict in the future. I think this is exactly what we want to avoid. We need to be conscious of the kind of historical examples, but also understand that, how serious that is. Now, China, as you correctly pointed out, it's not necessarily a military threat at the moment, but it is investing in a lot in both its military capability and in its technologies. And I think that kind of technological edge, the technological elements, I think they're very much a concern. I think we talked about 5G. It's not really about the hardware or software. It's really about who sets the standard. It was saying that the 5G is now going to be owned by a Chinese state-owned company or a company related to a Chinese state. What does that mean for how do we manage our IT data flows? The more network, the more connected we become. Does that pose a threat? Absolutely, it is something for us to consider. But I think in terms of what to do, in terms of what alliance is looking at, vis-a-vis China, I think first of all is a united approach. We have to work together to understand the challenges and risks that China's rise is posing to the alliance and its members. I think and try to solve that, to see that through the common lens, understand, and look at the scenarios of what can we do to not necessarily counter, but really understand, deeply understand what's out there and how can we counter that. The second thing is really connecting the dots. Yes, China, again, is not militarily a threat. The 5G, the technological investments in technology that are able to, to fuel in a very kind of authoritarian way, they're able to get maybe more bang for the buck, as we say. But I think it's something eventually can connect also to a security threat. So essentially something we have to watch and connect those dots, that what's happening in the so-called private sector in China actually can have a real cascading effect on the national, on a kind of national, international order. And third thing is obviously it's investing in technology ourselves. I think we understand what the emerging technologies are. We have a great we have great institutions within NATO and around NATO who tell us where the future warfare is going, and we need to also put the money. We need to invest. Investing is essential because again, there's no free lunch. So that's kind of rough approximation of the approach to China.
Thank you. Certainly for the first step is understanding those risks and vulnerabilities across the alliance. So certainly a space to watch. We are reaching the halfway point, so I would love to open it up, but General Veerman, I have one last question for you. We've been talking a lot about these non-conventional threats and some of the new ways that NATO is adapting. But how do you see the role of conventional capabilities for NATO in 2030? And how do we avoid losing focus on NATO's fundamentals?
Well, first of all, I think the pandemic has shown that the pandemic is not replacing the old conflicts. Some of the old conflicts are just accelerated and become more dynamic. You can look around the world, you see Iraq, you see Syria, you see Libya, and you continue this list. So obviously, the key task of NATO, which have been quoted already by Godrimas, are still relevant. And one of them is clearly collective defense. So therefore, there will be a role of conventional capabilities NATO will need, because we won't be in a position to successfully maintain peace and freedom of our member states and defend their territorial integrity and sovereignty. So there is a role for conventional capabilities. However, we have to revisit the mix. How do we insert conventional capabilities into modern technologies, which may come from an interesting combination of civilian activities. And that is, I think, the challenge we are facing today. In the good old times, we had an idea, and we as the military, what we needed. And then it took us about 10 years for a big system to get it online. Today, we see a lot of technological drivers outside of the military, outside of the traditional armaments industry, and the challenge. And therefore, we have a Allied Command transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, which is providing a platform to survey what happens technology-wise. And NATO has a very extensive science and technology network with the Science and Technology Organization. So we observe what happens on the civilian market, what are the small startups doing, are coming up with. And sometimes it's the combination of several startup ideas which lead to a significant quantum leap in usable technology. So we have to preserve the role of conventional capabilities, what we have to fit them into a picture of modern technologies, including emerging and disruptive technologies.
It's a really great point. Well, speaking of conventional capabilities, I do have a question here from Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, who's asking about the importance of the greater Black Sea region for NATO. And he wants to know, how can we help raise the priority on the region? We hear a lot about the Baltic Sea and not so much about the Black Sea. So would be interested to hear your thoughts on that. He also wants to know Ayesha Jaglinska's prediction for the Army-Navy game this year, but I think we'll prioritize the Black Sea.
Ben, first of all, thank you much for that question. I didn't expect anything else from you right now. Well, the Black Sea region, you are very well aware of what happens there, what are the security challenges, and you are aware of the nations placed in that part of the world, that they are anxious, that they are not that much in the focus as some other countries are in the focus when we are looking towards our potential peer competitor, Russia. If we look back into the year 2014, I mean, where did this crisis start? It didn't start in the Baltic region. It started in the Crimean Peninsula, which is the Black Sea region. So obviously, we are facing a Russia that does not concentrate military activities to the northeast only, but is very, very active in the southeast as well. We have seen a growth of the Black Sea fleet of the Russian Federation. We have seen and are still seeing an increase of military capabilities on the Crimean Peninsula, some very unusual capabilities, I would say, which are still giving a kind of challenge to our intelligence people, what it all means. And that shows that NATO should focus more on the Black Sea region. And I think our partners in that region are doing a very good job to promote their ideas in NATO. And I think we are refocusing on the Black Sea region. And you are active in this field as well, Ben. Thank you much for that.
Thank you. Another follow-on question from Peter Borisov is about, as you mentioned, General, NATO's partners in the Black Sea region, including Ukraine. And maybe ASG Jaglinskis, you have some thoughts on this in your civilian hat, but how can NATO best support the partners in the region? And we saw recently Ukraine being designated as enhanced opportunity partner status, which I think is an important development. But what more can the alliance do to support partners in the region with both conventional capabilities, but also to help build resilience against some of these non-conventional threats that we've been talking about, including the pandemic?
Well, I think speaking of, specifically Ukraine, I think the step that, that NATO took by acknowledging Ukraine as an EOP, giving an EOP status, that's a great step forward. I think we have been doing it both bilateral, I remember in my time in the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense, is really partnering with all these different institutions, both grassroots as well as governmental institutions, as well as military units, and really taking them, providing them support that they need at this difficult time for the country. I think, country success, country's prosperity and stability are dependent upon their security situation. And while understanding that while the war is raging, while that security situation is unbalanced or disbalanced, it's very hard to do anything else, in a very productive way, either economically, socially, culturally, or politically. And until those conflicts get resolved, it'll be very, very difficult to move forward. But there are things that Western community have been doing, and we need to continue to do in terms of monetary, financial aid, military aid, but also military training and kind of giving that cultural impetus to transform into a more democratic, into a transparent society. I think we're doing a lot. Can we do more? Perhaps. This never-ending debate on that. But I think it's important to first of all consider that these nations, whether it's Ukraine, for example, is part of the Western family of countries, and I think they are. They're in a situation 5 years ago when we were 30 years ago. Now we've been for 15 years. We were in NATO. We're part of EU. So it's important to be not judgmental, but really supportive to these goals that Ukrainians, for example, are setting for themselves.
Thank you. We've got another question here for General Veerman about capabilities and the future. NATO recently announced space as a new domain for operations. And our viewers would like to hear a little bit more about what should NATO be doing in space as we look to 2030.
Well, I think there's no question that space has become a domain which is quite critical to be successful. You can do a lot of things from space. You can do reconnaissance, you can communicate, you can target. So all activities that are of direct military relevance. So it is no surprise that space now has become so important. In the space domain, I think we'll see similar developments as we have seen in cyber. And this is very natural for the alliance. We rely on our member states, but we have to clearly coordinate better what capabilities we have in member states, and we have to exploit them for our purposes. So there is a huge coordination task. And of course, we have to close gaps in our capabilities, and we have to be aware of what our potential opponents are doing in space. We probably see a situation where space domain will rely on national capabilities. So we will have a kind of process that allows us to ask for space effects. So I don't expect NATO to run a huge space satellite organization. I expect a lot of coordination. I expect a lot of contribution from nations, and I expect a mechanism that allows NATO, if it becomes necessary, to ask for space effects. And that is the challenge we are currently facing. We are in the process of defining the mechanisms, organizational structure in this space domain. This is fairly new. But we are hopeful and optimistic that by the end of the year, we have a clear understanding of space as an operational domain in NATO.
Thank you. We have another question about future threats and current threats that NATO is tackling. Ayeshi Yaglinskas, perhaps you can speak to this one. The viewer is asking about migration, which continues to be a challenge in NATO's southern neighborhood along the Mediterranean. And given everything that we're seeing, all the developments in Libya and even continuing in Syria, this is tangential to NATO's responsibilities. But how do you see NATO playing a role in tackling some of those challenges related to the southern flank and migration in particular?
Well, I think that's a great question, Lauren. I think what that question really epitomizes is the so-called 360 approach to threats that NATO has. And so in this sort of approach, we take a look at our most viable competitor, Russia, but we understand that the threat of terrorism comes from a variety of factors, and one of them is that the certain countries are just so unstable, and where people can be affected by these sort of rogue elements, the terrorist elements, and most of them are in the south, whether it's Sahel or the Middle East. So I think migration is whether you can say that yes, migration is not a real business of NATO, but in this world, in the world of complexity, where threats connect with each other, where functions and different elements of and themes intersect, I think it's absolutely essential to have an approach to migration, to have an approach to helping those countries that are struggling with the with poverty and other instability and domestic international terrorism, to help people there. So it's so that's our approach, has always been there. I mean, we are the Sahel topic has been a topic in our discussions for quite some time. Middle East, we are in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan, again, creating or attempting to create a more stable, more democratic, more transparent, more stable societies there. So it's really the question on migration is really the sign that the threats, the environment, and threat assessment is expanding. It's into much broader areas than just conventional threats. So it's definitely for NATO to be part of.
Well, speaking of capacity building and training, General Veerman, maybe you could speak a little bit to NATO's future missions. We're hearing a lot of news recently about Afghanistan and Russia's potential role there. Could you speak to how you see NATO's future in Afghanistan and the training mission in Iraq and some of those activities as part of NATO's future capabilities looking to 2030?
Well, in Afghanistan, we have seen some promising developments, no question. The US-Taliban agreement was a very promising event. And we hope that, I think what the military said all the time, that in Afghanistan, there will be only a political solution. We are coming closer to this. Having said that, we see the delay in the inner Afghan peace process. The peace talks have not started yet. And the COVID situation is not helping this situation at all. Then we see I would say, levels of violence that go up and down in Afghanistan. And one thing is clear for NATO. We went in together, we'll adapt together our structures, and we'll leave Afghanistan together. We have, I think, good conditions now, as far as they can be called good in Afghanistan. And hopefully, the US-Taliban agreement will carry through the day, and the peace talks will end in a result. So therefore, I think we are on a positive path. We are not there yet. We have to very carefully observe whether the conditions are being met. And I can assure you that all allies here in the NATO have a very close eye on the developments and on the conditions in order to agree together as an alliance what we are supposed to do in Afghanistan in the future. In Iraq, you asked also on Iraq, we have a mission in Iraq, the NATO mission in Iraq. We have currently a presence in Iraq, but we have suspended our training activities. There are two factors why we have suspended the activities. One is the health risk due to COVID, and the other is that we still are in the process of discussing with the Iraqi government, which was difficult to find a Iraqi government for quite some time, to make up their mind what is their requirement towards NATO. We are in a constructive dialogue. These are in parallel or paralleled by the US strategic talks with Iraq. And NATO stands ready to provide whatever the Iraqi government requires as training activities, as support they want to have us. And just to conclude with the observation that goes back to the last question to get Remus, we have a vested interest in having a stable neighborhood, a stable Iraq, because if our neighborhood is more stable, we are more secure.
Certainly. Well, we do have another question, and I always love when we challenge ourselves in these conversations. And the viewer is asking, has anyone criticized NATO's role in responding to the pandemic as perhaps overreach? This debate about, is NATO primarily should be focusing on traditional military threats, or is it helpful for NATO to plug into some of these broader threats that may seem outside of NATO's traditional footprint? And ASG Jeglinskas, maybe you could talk a little bit about differing threat perceptions within the alliance as we think about NATO's future role.
I think, when the whole virus, the whole crisis has, erupted, that was, 3-4 months ago. There was some discussions naturally, whether you talk with international staff, or you talk about, with various people from different countries, or my own country. So what's the role? Is there really a role for NATO? This is a health crisis. This is, a virus, a sanitary problem that needs to be dealt with at the whole of government level. Is there a specific role for NATO, a specific role for the militaries? But that sort of talk, I think, subsided quite quickly. And I think there's two elements here. First of all, the military is an essential part of each nation's civil society. It's not a separate element. So military's role is essential in countering these sort of disasters, these sort of threats, whatever happens, viruses. And we have those assets. We have certain military organizations have certain structure, certain crisis management capabilities. People have been trained. So what's important is really, and what I think the crisis has demonstrated, that, and I probably speak when it's 30 countries, 30 member states at NATO, but I haven't seen any countries where military has not performed to a standard in these situations. Military has done a lot of heavy lifting in this in every nation nationwide. I think there's also important is that NATO as an alliance, we have to look at threats broadly. It's and what has been very evident ever since the beginning of the crisis, that all these elements, we talked about a little bit about disinformation, about this sort of a fake news and other things coming from our true competitors, whether it's Russia or some non-state actors, NATO had to respond. There's definitely a role for NATO. We're part of that. We're part of the global community. We're part of the global, global world order. So I think it's, some initially, very naturally, I think it's, you want to raise a question: is this a crisis for me? What's my role there? But I think that's, very quickly it has become the crisis that we play an essential role. And I think, what I'm hearing is, it's been a good success.
And maybe if I could ask you just to say a quick follow-up word, because this gets at the announcement of the forward-looking reflection process for NATO, which came out of the 2019 London summit. which is meant to be a group of experts helping support the alliance think through how to strengthen NATO's political dimension and think through how we can use NATO more politically, to use the Secretary General's words. And the United States is represented on the group by CEPA's Vice Chair, Wes Mitchell. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about this. But ASG, could you help us understand a little bit more what that means? What's the process designed to do, and what does it mean to use NATO more politically?
Yeah, I always get the hardest question, huh? No, just kidding. But I think I think we got to stay back, take a quick step back, and think about overall, NATO's mission. NATO's mission is to defend freedom, but the threat environment is changing. It's the threats are multiplying; they're converging. There's an exponential trend in technology, as General has mentioned. There's the number of technologies affecting our threat assessment and creating sort of a lot of unknowns is truly exponential. There are shifts in societies that are affecting local and then national political structures, which again have some sort of cascading effect on global politics as well. So in light of that, it's absolutely critical to revisit the paradigm that NATO is operating in. I think, and that's really the outcome of that revisit, that we need to have a reflection process. Now, of course, we're all relying on Wes, by the way, to come up with some great solutions. But I think one thing is to accomplish our mission to defend freedom, we need to be politically and militarily strong. And what does it mean politically? And militarily, we can all grasp, I think, that more or less, although again, it's a very complex file as well. It's military capability and readiness and ability to kind of do interoperable operations and many other things. But politically, it really is about unity, but it also about ability to discuss items that go way beyond what we have been discussing so far. So it's really expanding the topic list into political discussions on things like economics, on technology, on 5G and China and climate change and many other things. Now that has to be, of course, and Secretary General has been very clear about it, that sort of the third leg of that approach is having a global approach to it. So basically, that we actually reach out to our partners around the world, whether it's in Asia or Latin America or any other region, and having those broad discussions and really making sense of the world, that hopefully having those discussions, having that kind of new format, not necessarily new, but it's an expanded format, will bring us more ideas, more insights that we're able to better counter those threats and able better defend and better deter the aggressors. And we all feel much safer. We all feel that the fundamental level of security in the society is such that allows us to do our most productive economic, social, cultural, and political work. So that's my winged answer to your question. But again, we're looking forward to Wes's response to that as well.
Thank you. That was a very nice way to bring it together. Thanks for taking that open-ended question. General Veerman, we're getting down to the end of our time here, but we did have one last question come in for you about the emerging technologies that you had started to speak about a little bit. We recently saw, we're seeing a lot about Russia's growing missile technologies and things like hypersonics, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the nuclear cruise missile that's under development. And we saw the Secretary General come out and say that, NATO's not necessarily going to mirror that posture, but to respond with an appropriate mix of political and military elements. From your perspective, is NATO competing in this space sufficiently? Our viewer wants to know what more NATO should be doing to invest in and keep our competitive edge when it comes to those emerging technologies that have defense applications.
First of all, I try to explain that we are doing quite a lot, in particular in the Air Command transformation, to benefit from all the bright ideas that are being developed on the civilian side to make best use and connect the dots so that we get a usable military capability. You particularly refer to the Russian missiles. Of course, this is a This is a threatening development. Russians have obviously put a lot of their scarce resources into this particular technological field, and they are quite good at it. And what Putin has announced first on slides is slowly becoming a reality to a certain degree. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that the existing nuclear weapons on this globe are still sufficient to destroy the world several times. So what's the added value? That's the real fundamental military question. So what's the added value of these new technologies? And you can clearly relate that to our growing capabilities to defend against ballistic nuclear missiles. That is an issue. And it is at the same time a part of the answer how we can deal with these technological developments on the Russian side. Then we have this rather disturbing development of a dual capable cruise missile with a range that infringes on the INF treaty. So this is a new challenge, and we have to rethink strategy. And we had that strategy of flexible response in the past, where we had direct conventional defense, we had theater nuclear weapons, and we had strategic nuclear weapons. So what we have lost in the late 25 years of crisis management, I would say a bit of mindset of strategic discussions. So I think we have to redust some of our strategic capabilities to deal in an appropriate way with these new technological challenges, which at the end of the scale don't change the world.
Thank you, General. Well, we have reached the end of our time. Let me thank our terrific speakers for the superb discussion. We covered a lot of ground there, starting with the pandemic all the way to NATO's future in 2030. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thanks to our audience for your active participation and the great range of diverse questions. And thanks to my terrific colleagues at CEPA and at NATO Public Diplomacy Division for helping to organize. I encourage all of you to keep in touch with us. We've got a lot of great work coming up on these issues. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, you can follow us on Twitter at CEPA or visit our website, cepa.org, to register for our mailing list for more great content on transatlantic issues. And with that, let me thank you all again and wishing everyone a safe and healthy week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lauren.